In 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire sold its public a very specific vision of warfare. It was an ideal of orderly bayonet charges, bright regimental colors, and disciplined infantry pushing forward. This lithograph depicts the Battle of Kraśnik, where the Austro-Hungarian First Army secured a massive tactical victory. The commander of the First Army, General Viktor Dankl, was celebrated as a hero of the empire. For delivering what appeared to be a swift and clean triumph, he was elevated to the nobility, taking the title of Count Dankl von Kraśnik. But the crisp uniforms of the studio portraits and the vibrant energy of the lithographs concealed the immediate cost of the campaign. Securing that ground at Kraśnik required the sacrifice of 15,000 Austro-Hungarian casualties in just 3 days. To comprehend the unfolding disaster on the Eastern Front, we have to look past the state-sponsored artwork. The true physical reality of the Lublin campaign is found in the unpolished, emerging medium of frontline photography. General Dankl's success on the battlefield created an immediate strategic illusion. The localized victory at Kraśnik convinced the Austro-Hungarian High Command that their preemptive strike strategy was flawless, blinding them to a broader operational crisis. This map illustrates the Kraśnik Paradox. Driving the First Army rapidly north toward Lublin dangerously overextended their supply lines. This exposed a 50-mile gap between the First and Fourth Armies, an operational vacuum leaving them vulnerable to the Russian Fifth Army. Planners in Vienna were charting troop movements on pristine maps, assuming rapid redeployments based on pre-war schedules. They failed to account for the physical toll required to march heavy infantry units back and forth across the region's rural topography. By pushing men forward faster than the logistical wagons could follow, the tactical success at Kraśnik traded immediate ground for a long-term strategic vulnerability. The archival record pulls us from pristine planning rooms directly into the mud. Here, soldiers of the Polish Legion's 1st Brigade attempt to move an artillery unit through the Lublin salient. Pre-war illusions of rapid victory evaporated with the autumn rains. The horse-drawn logistical chains, essential for feeding the army and supplying artillery shells, immediately sank into the rutted roads and ground to a halt. Operational movement in the Lublin-Kraśnik uplands was dictated by the region's deep, clay-rich loess soil. Under dry conditions, this soil pulverizes into a fine, choking dust. But when saturated with heavy rainfall, the loess undergoes a rapid structural transformation, turning into a highly viscous, sticky clay. This diagram demonstrates the biomechanics of marching through that terrain. The adhesion of the wet clay to heavy mobilization boots created severe mechanical drag. Every single footstep required increased shear stress to overcome the dead weight clinging to the leather. Soldiers marched for weeks without spare socks or drying facilities. The continuous exposure to moisture and the relentless friction of wet, clay-saturated leather broke down the epidermal tissue of their feet. This led to mass outbreaks of early-stage trench foot, leaving thousands unable to walk. Before the Russian artillery could find its range, the physical reality of the Lublin mud had already immobilized the Austro-Hungarian war machine. In early September, the tactical focus shifted to the Battle of Komarów. State-sponsored illustrations of this engagement, like this lithograph by Karl Pipik, continue to depict warfare as a highly structured kinetic infantry assault against fortified trenches. The frontline photography reveals a much more improvised reality. Unlike the deep, static trench networks being constructed on the Western Front, troops in the Galician campaign lacked both the time and the engineering tools to excavate continuous defensive lines. During engagements at locations like Wanzin Farm, infantry units had to adapt whatever was available to survive. They converted existing agricultural structures, sunken farm roads, drainage ditches, and thick stone barn walls into desperate, shallow earthworks. These hasty, localized defenses offered very little protection against 20th-century technology. When the high explosive and shrapnel rounds of modern hurricane fire struck these farmhouses, the stone and timber became deadly secondary projectiles. The doctrines of the previous century mandated upright, aggressive advances. The brutal efficiency of modern artillery immediately corrected that assumption, forcing men to simply try and hide in the dirt to survive. After the massive kinetic clashes of August and September, the mobile campaign stalled. The Austro-Hungarian and German armies, struggling with overextended lines and exhausted supply trains, transitioned into a brutal occupying force. Heavy artillery and the beginnings of trench warfare stripped traditional cavalry of its offensive utility. These mounted patrols in Lublin document how Dragoon and Uhlan regiments were repurposed into military police, tasked with enforcing curfews upon the Polish residents. Because their pre-war logistical networks had collapsed under the strain of the mud and the vast geography, the military government was forced to extract the resources for its own survival directly from the civilian landscape. The paperwork of the occupation, like this Reiseschein travel pass, systematically strangled the local economy. The civilian population was subjected to strict movement controls, severe food rationing, and aggressive metal requisition decrees. Following the capture of Lublin, the city became a central transit hub. This single photograph captures the logistical nightmare of funneling thousands of Russian prisoners of war into an urban environment, already suffering from acute resource shortages. Within months, the patriotic rhetoric of a swift, maneuvering victory had completely dissolved. In its place was a graphic, undeniable reality of structural ruin and systemic economic extraction. The intense artillery barrages of late 1914 left permanent physical scars across the region. Residential centers and historic town squares were reduced to ash and rubble, erasing decades of civilian development in a matter of days. The generals who orchestrated the initial strikes consistently overestimated the endurance of their troops. They planned for a war won by heroic spirit, while entirely ignoring the physiological limits of the men tasked with executing those orders. The ultimate reality is documented in the forensic footprint left behind. Thousands of fallen soldiers were placed into massive, hastily dug trenches. These earthen ramparts contrast the victorious paintings the public was fed, proving the human body remains the most vulnerable component of war.